Good afternoon, our dear friend Jonathan. My name is Chimakonam Zondi. I apologize that I was coming off another meeting to here. Just learned that the chairperson of this session is not here right now. I don't know what might have happened. So I've got to step in and proceed. It is a great honor to host you this conversation that seeks to understand African thought system, indigenous thinking about Africa. This is part of our Rethinking Africa series of conversation.
Hello, Prof. Hi, Prof.
Sorry, I got blocked somehow by the devil. I am back here, Victor. I am back. So I was saying we are very pleased and very privileged to have Professor Jonathan O. Chimakonam, who's with the Department of Philosophy at the University of Pretoria, who's written prolifically in this area and has even established an epistemic angle, a whole school of thought for thinking from the African point of view, dealt with questions of African philosophy, its meaning, its implication, and many related subjects. We have invited him today to help us think through some form of understanding that we might reach regarding what does it mean to have an African thought system. Professor Jonathan, we really appreciate it and are pleased that you were able to join us this morning. I would like to hand over the floor to you, and this will be followed by a Q&A session that will get us going. It's a pleasure to have you, sir. We really appreciate the work we are doing. Please help us drink from your very huge well of knowledge. Prof. Jonathan?
Thank you very much, dear colleague, Professor Zondi, and your team for inviting me to give this talk. And thank you to those who have been able to join us from different places. Thank you for coming to listen to me. I hope that by the end of this talk, that we will all find a way to grow together in knowledge. Let me, okay. All right, so understanding the African thought system, the guide for scholars of African studies. African studies is an important field of research. There are many more journals dedicated to this field. Different academic publishers are publishing books and collections on these subjects every new day. There are people who chair, professorial chair in African studies. And so on numerous conferences have been called on the continent, Europe, North America, and elsewhere. There are institutes of African studies everywhere in the world. As a matter of fact, there are even libraries dedicated to African studies outside the continent. I have seen such a library in Europe and elsewhere myself. So it's an important subject to talk about, but equally important is to really understand the subject we are talking about. It's entirely possible that a chunk of well-respected scholars in this field might not have paid adequate attention to the structural appurtenances of the area of study. And today, I will share my views and hope that we will explore this together. As always, I like to caution my audience that my intention, my goal is not to get you to agree with me. It is not to persuade you to accept what I'm about to say here today, but to provoke you enough, sufficiently enough, to debate with me and debate amongst yourselves, and perhaps find a way as you go home to reach your own conviction on the subject of today's talk. So let me begin with conceptual analysis. Thought system is made up of two terms, thought and system. All right? Literally, what do they mean? Thought could refer to an activity or process, okay, of thinking. And it can also refer to ideas produced from such activities, all right? And system typically is an interconnected network, a sort of mechanism in which many components are fused together and function by a certain set of rules. Okay, so put together, a thought system for me, by my own definition, would be a framework for shaping thinking processes and organizing ideas along the lines of specific methods grounded in a specific logic. I urge us to pay attention to some of the key concepts there and even the tenses in that sentence. A framework for shaping thinking processes and organizing ideas along the lines of specific methods grounded in a specific logic. I hope that in the course of my lecture that this definition would be, this condensed definition would be broken down and clarified. So thought systems, as other scholars who have ventured to write about this topic, have cultural roots in each society and account for the differences in how people in different societies view the world, how they see the world, how they approach reality, okay? And thought systems define the criteria for various knowledge ecologies, okay? Such as the Western, Asian, African epistemes, and so on and so forth. So in other words, when we want to talk about the epistemic accumulation of Western peoples, we are indirectly talking about a particular thought system that has shaped such an epistemic edifice. The same goes for the Asian peoples and the African peoples and other, regions of the world where it has been established that people who populate such regions share a lot, even though there may be heterogeneous cultures there, but there are certain threads that run across those people that make up such a, big regional culture, such as Africa, such as Asia, and the Western world, I mean Western Europe and North America. Okay, so let us understand the functions of thought system. Thought systems, according to Nisbet et al., help us to shape our perception of the world, the way we look at the world, okay? Often we run into people from different cultures who have different ideas of the world, who have different set of beliefs, who see things differently. the same action may trigger a different type of response. In fact, as recently as a few days ago, I was in Paris where I gave a talk, but I wanted to move from one part of the city to another part of the city, and I needed help from someone at the train station. Everything was written in French, so I needed help, and I had to signal to him, but my signal offended him so much. He demanded apology. He was so furious. Again, this is what I would typically do in my country, Nigeria. That is the normal way to signal people if you don't want to scream. So that is how thought systems shape our perception of the world. Just an example. They configure our sense of meaning, okay? Such that that signal, that gesture by me could, in a particular culture, mean a signal to draw attention in another culture becomes offensive, okay? Thought system also influence our actions. Thought systems influence our actions, okay? Because they shape the way you think. And as the Ghanaian statesman Kwame Nkrumah would say, thoughts inform actions. They go on to inform how we act, how we behave towards people. And also thought systems regulate acceptable and unacceptable ways of thinking and acting in a given epistemic worldview. Okay, so, but why should we try to articulate the African thought system? Why should we do that? Why can't we just simply continue to do scholarship according to the Western thought system that's been passed on to us through the medium of colonialism? Why shouldn't we continue in that light? Why shouldn't we try to catch up, mimic, embody the cultures that's been passed on to us by the colonialists? All right? Why shouldn't we do that? Why should we try to articulate the African thought system and let it guide thoughts? Let it guide thinking, creative, imaginative, critical. Let it guide our attempts to build our society, to develop our society. Why shouldn't we? Why should we articulate the African thought system? So I say, for example, we need to do so to mark our civilizational contributions. 100 years from now, 500 years from now, 2 millennia from now, historians and people will be studying and giving credit to different people that lived at this time of what they achieved and contributed to the civilization of that time. Which one would they attribute to us? Because if you pursue the act of invention, or theorization, or development, or whatever, using the thought system of another culture, it is easy for that culture to, sort of assimilate whatever you have contributed and nativize it, make it their own. All right? And so it's important that we articulate the thought system of the African people and let it underlie what we do in various intellectual activities. Second, to regain respect in the Committee of Cultures. Now, we all know the damage, intellectual, environmental, physical, and what have you, social, that slavery, racialism, colonialism have done to the African psyche. We all know the damage it's done to the African history, to the African peoples, to the African polity, and so on and so forth. And laws have been made everywhere in the world, and policies have been enacted in different agencies of countries, yet racialism continues to have a field day. Why is that? As an African, you'd have to do 10 times more work to gain your respect anywhere you find yourself, even as an academic. You find yourself at an international conference, those coming with a different skin already, gets the respect. But you have to take the podium and do 10 times more work to gain a little respect. Now, these things are all interconnected. You're passing through the airport and they subject you to a terrible form of scrutiny and searching and all that. These things are all interconnected. Okay? Even those who say they are presidents and heads of states in Africa, when they go for their international gatherings, some of them experience of manner of subordination and disrespect. These things are all interconnected. It does not mean that it is not right to say that someone must build a rocket before they are recognized and respected. No, those are the character issues that some people have. But on our own part, it is important to gain respect, the community of other cultures. You don't want to be a member of a culture that is there to consume and comment about what's produced by other people. And when members of your own culture are even part of those who are producing those things, their contributions are silenced under the umbrella of the nativity of that invention or product. So it's important that we regain respect at the Committee of Cultures. There are various African countries import nearly everything they consume and produce very little. Export raw materials without added value many places. And there's so much poverty in these places. How can you have, an adequate pedigree, respect at the Committee of Nations? So it's important we articulate our thought system because that's where it all begins. If you are working in the sciences, arts, or wherever, whatever you are doing and you are using the thought system of another culture, you are doing imitative thinking. You are not doing creative thinking, let alone imaginative thinking. Number 3, to cultivate thinking societies. We don't have thinking societies in Africa. We have imitative societies. We have nodding societies. We need to cultivate thinking societies. And one way to do that is to first of all articulate the basis, the foundation of our thought processes, to overcome imitative thinking itself and eminently begin to do serious critical to creative and imaginative thinking, and to develop Africa, make progress economically, socially, politically, and what have you. So what have organizations, what have academic institutions, what have scholars of African studies, what have schools of thought in African studies done to ensure that the African thought system is articulated, to ensure that scholarship is done through that thought system, to ensure that we can lay claim to our own originality? What have they done? The literature is quite scant, I must tell you. Everyone assumes that African studies is what you do when you engage with one aspect of Africa, African culture, African particular location, African peoples, African practices, then you're doing African. So that's not true. Anybody can do that from any point of view. If you are doing that from the perspective of another thought system, you're not doing African studies. I will tell you what we will be doing if we are doing that as this talk progresses. But as a school of thought that I am very proud to say that I belong to as a second generation member, and that is the Calabar School of Philosophy, that has articulated a model of African thought system and are philosophizing and thinking through that model, as I shall show in the course of this talk. But as to give background to those of us who are not familiar with the works of elements of the Calabar School of Philosophy, let me tell us a bit about that school. As at the time, the great debate in African philosophy was winding up in the 1980s. There was a problem, okay? Certain disillusionment. What again are we going to do? We've debated for nearly 4 decades whether African philosophy existed or not. What else should we do? One common idea that was up at that time was system building. It's time to start building systems of African philosophy. But how do you build systems of African philosophy if you haven't first taken care of the foundation on top of which those systems are going to rest? So the fundamental foundational work needed to be done, and that was when the school emerged in the early 1990s to start the project where it ought to be started at a foundational level. Castles, of course, we see them hanging in the air, but without foundation, they won't be hanging there and they will ultimately collapse. And that is why elements of the Calabar School of Philosophy decided to start the project from the foundation. This is what scholars from different fields of African studies ought to do. In any case, as philosophy is the queen of all sciences and the home of thinking itself, one could say that it is the duty of the African philosophers to build that system. Well, the Calabar School attempted that, convened at the University of Calabar, in Calabar, Eastern Nigeria, including just some a few adjoining institutions around that university. Some prominent members of the first generation members of that school include Pantaleon Irebu, Innocent Asuzu, Chris Ijoma, Godfrey Ozumba, Redugumen, and so on and so forth. And the main task of this school, like I said, was to build systems of African philosophy, starting from the foundation. In 2014, because membership of this school blossomed and went beyond Nigeria, even beyond the continent, the name of the school had to acquire the name Conversational School of Philosophy to cover the international dimension of the school. Now, the school has a journal that is edited by Dr. Arabia Tu of University of Witwatersrand. The journal is called Arumaroka Journal of Conversational Thinking. Okay, so enough about the school. The school has an ideological structure that informed its approach to thinking, which I will not dwell on here. I'll have to skip it to focus on the subject of this talk. So, what is the nature of a typical thought system? Because when we say thought system, people might be listening to me and wondering, okay, what is really? We've been hearing thought system every day. We even use it in our writings. But what is the nature of a typical thought system? Okay, so you see 2 figures there before you. Figure 2 represents the skeleton, all right? And figure 1 is the content of the skeleton, the structure itself. Okay, so a typical thought system has 3 components. And that is the foundational component, the architectural component, and the doctrinal component. All right, and each of these components has constituents. For example, the foundational component of a thought system has 2 main ingredients there: logic and ontology. All right, logic, again, prescribes the laws that govern reasoning. Ontology deals with realities involved in the reasoning processes. Because if you're reasoning about something, you're reasoning about something. Every reasoning is reasoning about something. And that is what ontology deals with. All right? Then on top of the foundation, that is the architectural component, you have methods, and you would see that this one is in plural. However, logic is in singular. All right? Methods. Logic is in singular because it deals with principles. These principles account for intelligibility. All right? That I speak and you understand me is because the language we communicate in, all of us understand the logic that underlies that language and its principles. But there could be methods in a system. There could be methods. These methods are various ways of applying the laws of logic that is at the foundation of that system. Okay? And on top, at the pinnacle of that pyramid, you see theories, concepts, theories, principles, ideas, you name it, laws and what have you. These deal with various ways of organizing ideas along, the line of a specific method you have chosen for your research or whatever you want to do. And this is the analog of a typical thought system. Okay, the differences that you find in different thought system, African, Western, Asian, is what occurs here at the foundational level. Okay, for example, the Western thought system is grounded on a two-value logic, a bivalent logic that Aristotle articulated in 3rd century BC. Okay, now this logic with a bivalent ontology, both of them shape all kinds of methods that people can formulate from this foundation. In the African thought system, we have undertaken research and benefited from the work that people who have described the African worldview in different places have done to arrive at the idea that the logic that best suits the thought system of Africa would be a trivalent, would be a truth glut type of logic, three-value logic, okay? With a commensurate trivalent ontology to map it, all right? And it is from that some members of the school have undertaken projects to articulate that logic, to develop that logic, and try to develop some methods from that logic. And this man, Innocent Asuzu, who is a member of the first generation member of the Calabar School, developed what he calls complementary logic in this book of 2004 and this book of 2013. And then another, Chris Ijoma, is a first generation member of this school, in an article published in 2006 and this book published in 2014, developed his three-value logic he calls harmonious monism. Now, as a member of the second generation member of this school, I stood on the shoulders of these giants to develop a much more sophisticated version of that logic in this book published in 2019. But before its publication, I had already published a few articles and chapters, and I've continued to develop it alongside some members of the third generation currently. In 2020, I edited this collection of seminal papers in African logic, philosophy, that both Asuzu and Ijoma contributed, and myself, each of us honing and fine-tuning what we had developed earlier on. And in 2021, in this book, that won the University of Pretoria's Vice Chancellor's Book Award in 2022, myself and a third generation member of that school, Uchenna Bonaya, tried to demonstrate how a work written that is grounded in that logic and driven by a method developed from that foundation could look like, okay? And that is a decolonial approach to philosophy that we demonstrated in this book. Okay, besides the logic, there is the ontological aspect and the works, the books, and the methodological works that some members of the school have done, and the doctrinal, and so on and so forth. There are so many works, but I just highlighted some books, no mention of articles and chapters. But here is where I want to start, having provided this background. I have given you, of course, the structure of a typical system, typical thought system, all right? So bearing that in mind, with the three components and the constituents of those components, let us try to give an elementary distinction between African and, say, Western thought system, that there be no confusions and that what we are saying is clear enough, okay? Now, for African thought system, it deals with relational field metaphysics. All right? What does that mean? It means that the approach to studying reality that comes from the African thought system is one that prioritizes relationship of the variables to be studied, the context of those relationships, okay, as you can see here, all right? And it is also complementaristic, okay, rather than deterministic and bivalent as you have in the Western side. But for the Western thought system, you have the ontic metaphysic, all right? A metaphysic that is focused on study objects and their properties, all right? And their thought system is also deterministic and bivalent. Deterministic in the sense that it tries to formally study reality in keeping with the laws, traditional laws of thought, of the logic that lies at its foundation. That is, and as a result, its propositions, denials, and affirmations are deterministic in the sense that statements that are made in such inquiries are the ones usually stipulate that a proposition is either necessary or impossible, proposition is either true or false, is bivalent, and deterministic. It can't be any other thing besides this or that. But here, in African thought, there's a way that approach to studying reality, the thought system, goes beyond the contradictory, deterministic, bivalent bar that you find in Western thought and becomes complementaristic. In other words, two variables could be mutually opposed, but it still will not stop them from having a form of relationship. Time permitting, I will discuss the 4 types of relationship that we have discovered in African thought. And finally, the African thought is holistic, relational, okay, thought, while the Western is analytic thought. By analytic, we mean, for example, identifying an object to be studied and trying to, have a piecemeal breakdown of that subject, its properties, in order to understand it better. This one is holistic. It views reality as a network where all kinds of entities are interconnected with one another, relating with one another, and in trying to understand each of those realities, attention is here paid to the relationship that reality has with other realities around it, and the relationship it has with each of those realities. In doing so, we'll understand why that reality behaves of the way it does and has the attributes that it has, and how those attributes and properties affect and direct its relationship with others. Okay, so in order that we clarify this, let us visit literature where these 2 prominent approaches, thought systems, have been described. Nisbet et al., an important article they published in 2001, tried to describe it, okay? They say that holistic thought involves an orientation to the context. Pay attention to the highlighted keywords, context or field as a whole, including attention to relationships between a focal object and the field, and a preference for explaining and predicting events on the basis of such relationships. Holistic approaches rely on experience-based knowledge rather than an abstract logic, and are dialectical, meaning that there is an emphasis on change, a recognition of contradiction, and of the need for multiple perspectives, and a search for the middle way between opposing variables. That is trivalent, tri-valued logic. Analytic thought, on the other hand, involves detachment of the object from its context, all right? Because there's this emphasis on the universality, but even the holistic thought that emphasizes context does not deny universality, as I shall demonstrate in the course of this work. The holistic thought of the African thought system that we developed also tries to explain reality, not only based on experience, but also on formal logic, as again, I will demonstrate in the course of this talk. So this probably appeals more to the Chinese as they, reasoned it. So, so there's a preference for using rules about the categories to explain and predict the object's behavior. Inferences rest in part on the practice of decontextualizing, okay, structure. That is why scholars of Western thought and African aficionados will always try to draw attention to the fact that what is standard scholarship should be acontextual, all right? But we have also demonstrated, and this is also something that you find in literature, the works of M. César, the letter he wrote to Maurice Torres, the then president of the Communist Party in France in 1958, mentioning, highlighting the point that that's the way the Western thought is presented, as if it is acontextual, whereas it is the cultural particular, and this is the words of Senator Rokobahan in his book of 1991, extending the cultural particular of a people into the universal, okay? And ASUS also has a principle that contexts this. So this is a broad description of the differences between the two thought systems. That's a difference. You can say you're doing African, we can say we are doing African studies and grounding it in Western thought system and still think we're doing African studies. It's not correct. So that is why it's important to draw this distinction. And what is the title of this? Understanding African Thought System, okay? So many scholars of African studies, as I said at the beginning, and I just give you a few citations here, believe that disparate cultures in the lower part of the continent share a lot in common. Now, some of these common threads that you find, everywhere from East to Southern Africa to West Africa, are social, some are cultural, some are linguistic, some are religious, and so on and so forth, okay? Now, focusing on how they perceive the world, think and act, a few common threads can be couched in the following concepts, and I highlight sharing, mutuality, caring, solidarity, uniqueness, interdependence, complementarity, and so on and so forth. We may have all read in the literature that African worldview is collectivist and that of the West is individualistic, based on individualistic ethos and so on and so forth. This is actually what these people are gesturing at, okay? So from this common thread, we have delved deeper to synthesize, sort of articulate, condense the ideas. So we can imagine a triangle of relational field metaphysics, okay, involving three pillars: relationship, okay, what you find in interdependence, solidarity, sharing, context, uniqueness, so on, complementation, complementarity, and so on and so forth. So a triangle of a relational field metaphysic will look like this, okay? And having synthesized it, we delve into literature to see what's going on there. And even in the arts, and we found to our interest that three-pronged relational metaphysics has always characterized even African arts of the ancient times. Okay, take a look at these two, standing on these three, and take a look at this family motif, for example. Okay, the father, the mother or mothers and children, all right, as the foundation of the African family. And then take a look at this, and you see that this is sounding on three pillars, okay? If you imagine this to be the family, all right, then you can see this arm signifying an interconnection of triple arms interweaving the interconnection, the network of existence that African ontology promotes, okay? That realities exist as a network. And in that network, realities have all kinds of relationships amongst them. And that appears to be what these Asian Africans were doing with this, demonstrating, okay? From the father, mother, and children, you could even have kinsmen from the father's side, kinsmen from the mother's side, kinsmen from the in-law side. And then all kinds of, and then the construction continues, you know, to the highest levels of society. And that is thoughts informing action of the African people. Now, the methodological, there's a methodological implication of this relational field metaphysic. Okay, the methods formulated from the laws of the logic underlying African thought system must be relational in the sense that they are gathered to enable us to study entities through their relationships. The context of such relationships, the possibility of negotiating contradictory relationships, the possibility of achieving complementarity therefrom. Okay, so it's important that we, you know, show why Africans value relationship. They don't just value relationship and go home. They value relationship. They do think through relationship. They understand the world through relationship. They understand the environment through relationship. You know, and this is what we've not been able to systematize into a proper thought system to enable scholars from different fields of African studies to just undertake another approach to studying reality. It's just like you want to go to Johannesburg, and then people set off from the same, you know, point, but they follow different routes, and then they arrive there. You know, in some ways, a route followed by this person might be better. In other ways, the one followed by the other one could also be better. Variety is the spice of life, and it's important that we honor that instead of these mimicry and attempt to latch on to what others have developed and abandon our own perspective and the values and the advantages that it may offer to the world at large. And I will explain, time permitting, the part of the reason why that is the case. So those of us who are doing African studies must pause and ask ourselves this question. Are my methods based on a relational field metaphysics? If the methods I employ to do my research as a scholar of African studies is not based on a relational field metaphysics, you are probably employing methods developed the West, the ones that are based on the ontic metaphysics of Western thought system. How can we then call the output of our research African studies? Let's bear this in mind as we proceed. But someone might be asking, all right, so much about method, so much about this. Can you give us an example of what an Africa-developed method would look like? A method developed based on this relational field metaphysics, a method that is grounded in the African thought system. Can you give us an example of what it might look like? Oh, yes. Elements of the Calabar School have been working hard, and this is the third decade of that school, okay? That is 3 different generations consistently handing over the baton to one another and developing these thoughts. And at least 3 methods have been developed, okay? By us also developed complementary reflection. And myself and other co-workers belonging to 2nd and 3rd generation have been tinkering with conversational thinking. Godfrey Ozumba, a member of the 1st generation, and myself developed integrativism. And Chris Ijoma, a member of the 1st generation, described his method as relational, but did not really do sufficient work to develop it appropriately before he passed on. So this is not to say that every work done employing methods developed in Western intellectual tradition are nonsensical. That's not what I'm saying. It is possible, and I'm willing to grant that some of these Western methods could be adapted, could be repurposed, okay, to suit the African thought system and deliver the sort of output that we desire. It's possible. But the question is, the African studies scholars who are employing these methods developed in Western tradition, methods from the Western thought system, are they repurposing these methods before they deploy? I don't know. I am not sure. But it's up to you, having seen what I have said so far about the typical structure of a thought system and the distinction between Western and African thought systems, to determine for yourself whether these people actually repurpose these methods before they use. In other words, why repurpose other people's methods? Why not develop yours? Method is everything. If you pay attention to the pyramid that I showed at the beginning of this talk, you'd notice that method is in between the foundational and doctrinal. It is the bridge that links both of them up. Method is all as far as inquiry is concerned. Show me your method and I'll show you the trajectory and the origin of your thought. And so we must take method seriously. All right. So I believe that even foreign methods could be repurposed. Okay, if and only if the inquirer readapts them to focus on one, relationships variables can construct with other variables, the context of each of those relationships, the possibility of complex level relationships. By complex level relationship, we mean relationship of opposed variables, mutually opposed variables. It's the sort of relationship they have. In Western thought, contradiction prevents two mutually opposed variables from having any fruitful relationship. But in African thought, it does not. Opposed variables can negotiate contradiction and still construct a fruitful relationship that we describe as complementary relationship. Okay, so briefly, I'm not going to discuss all the methods that these examples, but I'm going to use two of them to demonstrate what we are doing. The first one is Asuzu. Innocent Asuzu, in his book of 2004 and 2007, developed his method of complementary reflection. There are many principles of this he articulated for this method, but I'm going to discuss four basic ones. The first one is the principle of integration. Okay? According to Asuzu, anything that exists serves a missing link of reality, because reality is an interconnected network of all entities.
5 minutes, Professor Jonathan.
Okay, so and then you have the progressive transformation, all right? And then you also have the Ibuaidanda imperative and the truth and authenticity criterion. These principles regulate the relationship of these variables that are interconnected, okay? And he also has three principles that drive these their movements. He calls it conjunctive and the disjunctive rules. So I may not be able to provide more details. In his book of 2007, he describes method as bridge building. All right? When someone builds a bridge, people will know his mind. Asuzu likens method to formulation to bridge building. As you can see in the pyramid, method is in between the foundational and the doctrinal levels of a thought system. Now, method then is a bridge. Linking there. So scholars of African studies, again, must ask themselves, how seriously do I take the methods of my study? Are those methods grounded in a truth-glow type of logic, Are they grounded in a trivalent ontology? Now, the another method is conversational thinking, okay? Which for want of time, I will not be able to digest. But suffice it to say that there are three basic concepts that derive from what is common among these various cultures in Africa. First one is relationship, context, and complementation. And this, we move to the ontology to articulate as three metaphysical principles: relationality, contextuality, and complementarity. I'll not be able to discuss that since I've been reminded of time. And then from these metaphysical principles, we articulated three laws of thought to underlie the truth glot type of logic that we propose should be at the foundation of the African thought system. Okay, again, I will not be able to break it down for you because of time. But then when we get to the level of method, we have two important modes to pay attention to. And they are the contextual and the complementary modes, all right? Think of these as the contextual modes, mode F and mode T respectively, which ordinarily might be seemingly opposed, but can complement at the complementary mode. Unlike in Hegelian dialectics, they don't lose themselves into the synthesis. No, they come there to complement and can again move to separate contexts through disjunctive motion, as the case may be. So, but then to tell you how important context is, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Prof.
Oh, good. Okay, so the light went out just now. Okay, so principle of context dependence of value is something that enables us to highlight the importance of context, and context of context, and how they can be used to negotiate contradiction. And then we have come to the enterprise of meaning making, but I will not focus on that. Let me conclude with these very important parts, if you allow me. Okay, so what is the challenge of African studies today? The main challenge of African studies is to define the thought system that grounds it. How such a thought system makes it African and a universal scholarship. How it shapes its methods. How it shapes its ontological landscape and its logical basis. Besides the contributions of the Calabar School, only fragments exist in extant literature addressing these very important challenges. Now, what happens when African studies is grounded in Western thought system or any other thought system? We create Frankenstein scholarship, and we say it's African studies. A piece of work is in African studies is Frankenstein scholarship if it's grounded in a non-African thought system. Its background logic is not a truth glot type, if its ontological background is not trivalent, if its methods are not those formulated from the laws of a truth glot logic, if its background logic and ontology are not those of alien thought system. So a Frankenstein scholarship is one produced by an admixture of content and structure from different thought systems. Question is, how many of what we are doing today falls into this category? And let me end with this slide by recommending my 6-point integrity test, okay, as a guide to African studies scholars. So the question that a typical African studies scholar should begin with is, what then makes a study African? It's not a sprinkling of the cultural worldviews or the maxims and proverbs. It is not the description of the peoples and their cultures and practices. No, that's not what makes it African studies. Okay? Anybody can do that from anywhere. All right? What makes a typical work African studies is that a study is African if it is grounded in African thought system that I have described. It studies reality through its relationship with others and the context of those relationships. It is grounded on a truth glot type of logic. Its ontological background is trivalent. Its methods are derived from the laws of the background logic and represent various ways of applying those laws. The ideas described, defended, or propagated are organized along the lines of those methods. These are the acid test, the criteria that the piece of work in African studies, by my recommendation, will have to meet before it qualifies as African studies. Otherwise, it would be Frankenstein's scholarship. Thank you. Let me stop here and hear from you. Are you there?
Hello.
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was huge. That was deep, and that was very interesting. That was really eye-opening. Let me see if we have questions. Or do you have questions on the chat? Jonathan would like to answer the questions on the chat, then we'll open it up for oral questions.
Okay, so Abia Abazid asks, was the first generation members of Calabar School part of the post-structural thought? Can you please elaborate more how they emerged in the 1990s? Did they face challenges from other African thinkers? Okay, thank you very much. Post-structuralism in Europe, deconstructionism, then the works of likes of them, Jacques Derrida, Foucault, and the rest of them, and all that is not. It's not little connection to what we do at the Calabar School. The first generation were people who had followed the debate, the great debate in African philosophy, as students themselves in the various universities around the world, and who had their doubts as to how things should proceed. And when they saw an opportunity, they decided that working differently, though they weren't really working together initially, they decided that African philosophy at this point is system building, just like everyone in the 1990s believed. And they decided to do something about it, okay? Have they had challenges from other African thinkers? Well, I wouldn't say so robustly, okay? Wouldn't say, because it is 30 years since this project has been on. When those who are supposed to mount serious criticisms, who are supposed to engage with your research, don't think that what you're doing is worth it, okay? When they think, okay, there's been a lot of methods produced in Western literature, which let's just use it and continue philosophizing. Let's just use it and continue doing our scholarship. Why go back to construct a foundation? Now, that's a dissipation of energy. When those who are supposed to engage with you do not understand the importance of these things, it might mean that the level of robust engagement that is supposed to take place, may not take place. And I think that is the case. Okay, so Kenneth Abudu asked, thank you so much for your presentation. Please, I would like you to explain the method of relational field metaphysics and how it differs from the so-called Western methods of research. Okay, so relational field metaphysics, as I mentioned, it is not a method. It is a kind of an idea that describes the foundations of African thought system. Okay, it simply says that there are certain things certain threads that that you can you find commonly across the worldviews that dot the landscape in many parts of Africa, especially the southern part. And that if we are to take a sampling of these common threads, how do we conceptualize them? Okay, what would be the basic concepts that we can tease out of them? Okay, and those are the concepts of relationship, context, and complementarity. Okay, by the way, the metaphysical principle of relationality states that variables necessarily interrelate, all things considered, because no variable is an ego solus. Okay, and understanding the perspective that reality does not exist as individuated substances, but as entities in a network that necessarily have to relate. That is what the relational field metaphysics is talking about. But then it is from the foundational level of thought, the thought system, that we can derive all kinds of methods. And you can say that all of those methods that may be derived will share certain attributes in common to show that they have common source, and that is relationality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let's hear from other school, from other people. The question I have is how do we build the same model, or how do we replicate, not necessarily the model, the initiative, the very idea of the Calabar School in other areas of the African continent? What would it take to do that? Because what was the inspiration in Calabar that you would need elsewhere, and all of that? Because many schools of thought have come from having a convivial environment of many scholars that are constantly in conversation with each other. But today we have very individualistic scholars, everybody driven by competition for subsidies and competition for projects, competition for accredited article numbers and stuff like that. So they all work in silo and work in individual offices. So therefore, I'm almost asking two sides question. How do we get that inspiration, and how do we overcome the current conditions that militate against having the same development as in there? Yeah.
Wonderful. This is a wonderful question. And one answer would be enlightenment. All right. And by enlightenment, I mean something quite deeper than knowledge. Knowledge is power. Enlightenment is freedom. All right. In the Calabar School, we realized that to go far, we've got to travel together. All right. And we realized that it is a better virtue than going fast individually. No civilization was ever built by disparate individuals working on their own. Everything that is magnificent and great was built by the combination of intellects. The problem, 3 weeks ago, I gave a talk at UNISA where I probed the mentality of the African today. The reason why these do or die competition, senseless competitions, really, because you could still work together and grow better. Why try to work alone and ensure that others don't grow? Why try to see? It is because of civilizational contamination that occurred when Europe invaded Africa. Okay? Now, these people are coming with superior technologies and what have you. And they contaminated, they made contact with people who had not reached that technological level as they have. What happens? What does civilizational contamination do? It makes people to abandon their own journey towards development and begin to mimic those who have come with something superior. And once that mentality settles, they accept that what they have is inferior. And once they accept that what they have is inferior, then there is a mad chase to become imitative thinking. Critical, creative, and imaginative thinking is abandoned entirely. Imitative thinking takes over. They want to be like the other people. And what happens amongst them? It becomes a race amongst them who mimics these other people the best, and at the same time, who stops others from coming up to mimic these people. So there's a worship for these people and a collective trauma and distrust amongst these other people down here who now try to undo one another. The mentality to undo one another cannot make room, a healthy room for combination of intellects. That is the problem. At the Calabar School, we have transcended that level of pettiness where people think of themselves as those who should be there and see the other as a threat, constant threats, mutual distrust. No, we transcended that. That is why I said enlightenment, knowing what your problems are and being able to go beyond those problems. Many schools of thought, like you said, my brother, have been established on this continent in different fields. All of them have collapsed and died within 1 year or 2 years. Those who made it to 5 years never actually accomplished anything. Because there is mutual distrust and hate. There is mutual distrust and hate. And pulled him down syndrome. No one reaches out to say, hey, that guy, that lady has got a talent. Let me, since I'm in a position, give them the opportunity to thrive. The typical African does not do that. And that is why we're not making progress. One sole individual runs, okay, worships the Westerners to be able to climb and be where he wants to be, will never question or criticize, even when that is needed. Ukoto, to be up there, and once he or she is there, uses that power to make sure that no other person climbs up. There cannot be combination of intellects where there is such a terrible mentality. But it all started with the civilizational contamination that occurred with the invasion of Africa when Europe made contact with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 2 other questions, and I think they'll be the last questions. We have one from Amara, which says, what would be a response to a critic who claims that developing African methods of research would lead to an Occam's razor? I have no idea what Occam's razor is. Complicated for my small brain. And then there's another chart.
Occam's razor is a little criterion that William of Ockham, medieval philosopher, articulated that that which could be done with one thing, one tool, or said in so few words, you don't have to multiply, create all kinds of alternative things where a solution already is. It's like inventing the wheel, okay? Reinventing the wheel. So that is the criticism. Why do we need to create new methods for African philosophy, for African thought, for African scholarship, when there are already existing methods that the Europeans have written in their textbooks that we read, that the European professors and teachers have taught us or taught those who taught us? Why should we? Because they do not understand the importance of intellectual tradition. If we do not set up an African intellectual tradition, everything any one of us accomplishes working within Western intellectual tradition becomes a civilizational accumulation of the Western peoples. 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, it will not be. How do you distinguish what we have accomplished as a people from what others have accomplished as a people when you use their method? I tell you something. Last week, I gave a talk in Paris at Sorbonne University. And when I finished the talk, one person, they were wowed by the depth of the talk, quite all right, and did not know that, felt that this type level of thinking was going on in Africa. They were wrong. There were imagination and assumptions there. How many of them actually visit here? But you know the question that I was asked first? Nobody asked me the question to challenge the claims that I made. The first question I was asked was to find a way to link all that I have done, the original ideas that I've put forward to the Western intellectual tradition, so that it will assimilate what I have done to the Western intellectual tradition. Of course, I dispatched it, and she kept quiet. So what am I trying to say? It is important that we carve our own niche, create our own foundation. If we think that it's important to do African studies, then it is important to do it the right way. If we think that it's important to talk of African history, African philosophy, African this, African that, African intellectual landscape, then it is even more important to do it the right way, to rest it on a firm foundation of African thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And then the other question is, it's asking you really to just give a practical application of the Calabar School. And I think for the benefit of everybody else, you might want to have an example of how these dynamics you explain actually help explain a practical issue. I guess even an issue of climate change, an issue of environmental degradation, an issue of poverty, or any of the issues that bedevil Africans all over.
Okay, so if we go to the traditional African societies and study the descriptions of traditional African worldviews in the literature, it will be easy for you to see that concerning environment, traditional Africans related with environment as if they were entities at the same pedestal with us, okay? And had very forms of taboos that are activated once a certain type of behavior or treatment of the environment or entities in the natural environment is carried out, okay? Now, that gives you elementary idea that traditional Africans tend to see themselves as being interconnected with the environment, all right? Now, personally, and in collaboration with some third generation members of the Calabar School, we've published essays articulating and even a book collection on environmental ethics from the African perspective. Okay, I'll refer you to the book I edited, published by Routledge in 2018 on African philosophy and environmental conservation. And my chapters there and the other articles that I have co-authored ever since then, for you to see the relational field metaphysics at play and the conversational method that we have developed at play. And I will also, for other topics from ethics to leadership and all that, I refer you to the works of members of this school for you to see how the method, the logic, how their theories are grounded, they are driven by some of these methods and grounded in the ontology and logic that they have also articulated, forming the thought system of the African people. I will not be able to continue further on this, but they're out there in the literature. You can go and read for yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's quickly take the two hands on that are up. I start with Lerato. Lerato, I think we have one hand. It's Lerato. Please,
thanks, Prof. Can you hear me?
And then Arabia.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, yes.
Thank Prof. That was an excellent presentation. Very, very, very informative and really all-encompassing. I just wanted to really interrogate, and let me just, turn the table on its head now. Would you say that Pan-Africanism then, on the basis of everything that you've outlined today, is assuming a degree of moral positivism on behalf of Africans collectively? And by that, I mean, it tends to be more so looking at Africa as within a framework of victimhood. And secondly, how would you advance the theoretical underpinnings of Pan-Africanism in today's fragmented world?
Brilliant.
Yes, thank you. And then
brilliant.
Let's check
question.
the other one. We'll take both of them. Arabia.
Hi, I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
we
I
can hear you very clearly, my brother.
All right, thank you. My question will be brief. Given your idea that African thought needs to be grounded on a three-valued logic, and the three-valued logic that you yourself has proposed as far as your writings on three-valued logic is concerned, seems to incorporate aspects of two-valued logic, because it also says it weakens the laws of thought in two-valued logic, but it doesn't expunge them from the system. So my question is, how do we know an idea is African or not if it stops at the level of two-valued logic, which is also incorporated in three-valued logic? Do we say it's European or not? Do we say it's African or not? Do we say it's Western or not? Just because it merely stops at the level of two-valued logic, which is, as you have argued, part of three-valued logic.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
And then maybe lastly, the one by Pascal. How do we avoid the trap of seeming like we are mimicking the West by simply creating methods and stuff like that?
Okay, I'm ready.
Thank you. Over to you, Prof. Jonathan.
Okay. Let me write this in. Okay, the first question on Pan-Africanism and what they are doing. The idea is great because it was conceptualized prior to the time many African countries secured their political independence.
Yeah.
We had their first meeting in the UK, the US, and they blossomed, accommodated many great intellectuals of that time, like Kwame Nkrumah, Marcus Garvey, and the rest of them. And continues to this day. Thabo Mbeki is an eminent thinker in South Africa who has done so much to get this idea running. But the problem is that many people don't even understand the goal of this Pan-African movement. And that is why one can argue that it has not drummed up the type of support, okay, that it should, that it deserves. All right, politically, and in terms of social organization, it's good to think of Africa as one giant country, federated country and what have you. It's good, but that's not the entire story about Pan-Africanism. It's also about galvanizing and recalibrating internal energies and intellects to make advances in different ways, from technological, economic, social, and what have you. The idea of working together, So often we pride ourselves as people who are Africans see themselves as brothers, sisters, and all that. But in terms of action, everyone shares this terrible distrust against one another. Most people, not everyone. And it informs the actions that people take, such that today those who are talking about Pan-Africanism either have little or no resources or support to actually produce the type of effect or result required in the polity out there. Okay? It is a good idea, just like many other ideas like decolonization. But the fact remains that, again, those of us who champion these ideas, even as academics, must live it. We must practice it. Okay? Those who will stand and talk about decolonization and play the victimhood you're talking about Africa, the West, and say all kinds of terrible things about the West. And by the way, some of them did really terrible things. And the same people will not even write a recommendation for a fellow African. The same people, when they find themselves in a panel when Africans have submitted wonderful proposals, will do whatever it takes to destroy that proposal, because they feel that this African gets this, then he climbs up and is at the same level with me. It is high time our words corresponded to our actions. It is good to talk about Pan-Africanism. It is more important for us to live it, for us to practice it, for us to stop seeing one another as threats, for us to learn to breach the barrier of that that mentality. and start thinking of working together in practice. If otherwise, people will still be talking about Pan-Africanism 100 years from now, 200 years from now, 1,000 years from now, without any practical results in our societies. So the second question says that in formulating the three laws of thought that undergird the Zumez logic, the three-value logic I formulated based on the shoulders of the two giants that went before me. In doing that, I had to weaken the three traditional laws formulated by Aristotle in the West, the 3rd century BC, weaken them in order to formulate this. In other words, I did not reject those laws. Neither did I reject that is specifically law of contradiction and excludement. I did not. I only recognized their limitations. And as a result, that limitations, I believe, was as a result of the strict way they were formulated. And in order to formulate laws that properly describe the way we study reality, the way we approach the world as a people on this continent, then it was important to weaken those laws in order to formulate the three additional laws. So now, but it does not mean that when you are applying, it does not mean that you should apply the two-value logic when it suits, and then go to three-value switch to. No, that's not what it means. In that, three laws of Zumez logic are incorporated necessary elements of the two-value logic, because it is not everything that is wrong. There's nothing. I'm not saying that every aspect of two-value logic and its laws limits African intellectual blossoming. No, it's only a certain aspect. And those are the things that I trimmed down when I formulated three additional laws. So incorporated in the three additional laws are also the good and real components of the two-value logic and its laws that you find in the West. Because having different thought system does not mean having different intellectual landscape entirely. No, that's not what it means. We are all human beings. We reason, we behave, we feel pain, we feel love, just like they do everywhere in the world. If I toss this pencil up here in Pretoria, it will fall down. That's two-value logic. If you toss it up in Washington, it will still fall down. That's two-value logic. So as members of human species living in this world, there are a lot that we share together. Historians and archaeologists demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that there has been immense cultural exchanges between our peoples and their peoples over time before the desiccation of the Sahara. All right. So, in fact, ancient model of history demonstrated clearly that the Hellenic islands in Greece, the birthplace of Western civilization, were once colonized by actors from Northern Africa and the Mediterranean. All right. So leading to a lot of sharing of cultures and all that. So I am not saying that when you you can apply this one and apply. No, incorporated in these are elements, good elements of the other one too, because it's also reflective of part of how we also think and study the world. Now, to the last question, how can we avoid the trap of mimicking the West? By starting to think critically, creatively, and imaginatively. All right? Think about different African countries. How many African countries actually add value to the raw materials they produce? How many? We were just learning recently that Niger, former colonial of France, sells its uranium to France for 88 cents a kilogram, whereas uranium in international market costs 200 euros a kilogram. And for decades, France takes the whole thing and pays them 88 cents. Okay? Now, why is that? From Niger to the Togo to the Congo and the rest of them, where Western intellectuals and government operators have changed regimes and installed stooges, okay, to Nigeria, my country, and to Liberia. What is happening in these countries are not different. Not different. Qualitatively nonsensical people are the worst of us, are ruling. The best of us are forced to immigrate to Europe and North America and give our brains there, unrecognized, unsung, and unwritten about in history, such that the great inventions we see in Europe and North America, many of them have Africans, brilliant minds, working, but who are never mentioned. Okay, so the way to avoid this is for us to start thinking, and it starts with you and me, scaling above mediocrity, petty mindset that makes us see one another as threats. That all we think about when we see one another is how to pull one another down, not how to work together, not how to fuse our intellect, not how to combine our abilities and talents. Here on this continent, there are many millionaires, for example, in South Africa here, native South African millionaires and billionaires. How many of them have endowed a professorial chairs, research project, funding research projects by fellow Africans to prove their intellect and invent and develop? How many of them do that? Flip the coin and you see how the other people do that for their own people too. And that's where we have to begin. Stop seeing one another as threats. Start thinking of combining. Start thinking of combining our efforts, talents, and intellects, so that the world would be good for everyone, not in opposition to them. No, we are still human beings and fellow occupants of this earth. And we must work together for the goodness of humanity as a whole. But we must start bringing something to the table as well. And we can only do that when we start thinking creatively, critically, and imaginatively, and leave our petty mentalities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Jonathan. That was quite a mouthful. I am sure that you have planted ideas in the minds of many people there about what does it mean practically to decolonize knowledge, and to think from Africa, and to think again about the way we think generally, and the possibilities of giving better voice to what we are doing, giving better meaning to what we are already doing. I am certain that many people would go all out to try and figure out how they could apply Ezumezu in order to understand what they are trying to understand in relation to why that food security strategies are not working, why water provision may not be working, how the transformation of the state is not working, and things of that nature. So thank you very much for sharing some of those thoughts, and we'll encourage everybody to go get those books, go read, and all of us need to try and apply. There are those like Professor Jonathan who create, who distill, who produce that knowledge. There's also a group of us who must then go on, use that knowledge to apply it to resolve general society's problem. Because African thought is not one just to think about and have mental gymnastics about, but it's meant to address Africa's real problems on the basis of African approaches to understanding society and how knowledge can be used for power. Thank you so much for sharing these thoughts and stimulating some of the thinking. And I'm sure you open to people coming back to you and say, this is how I understand the logic. Am I understanding it properly before they apply it in this or in that thing? So it was really, really mind-blowing, as Paul puts it. Really, really appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing from you in future as well. So thank you very much. And thank you to Marcelo Lepuru, who organized this. Let me just hand it over to him to close this. Marcelo, say something in closing. You put this all together.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm not sure if I'm audible enough.
Yeah, we can hear you very well.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, thank you for an interesting presentation on the on African studies and the nature of African thought system. So my duty really is to just provide a brief reflection on what the seminar really covered. But just to I'm just gonna try to be brief because of time constraint. But I think just to thank Prof. Zondi and the audience. Yeah, my name is Masilo Lipuru, so I was part of the organizing committee together with my colleague Nompumele Londaonde. So briefly, this is my reflections on on the seminar. So basically, there were two things that the professor basically focused on, which is African studies and African thought system. So in the beginning of the seminar, he basically started by foregrounding the nature of African studies, which he said that it's only African studies to an extent that is based on the African thought system and what he called the relational field metaphysics and also conversational thinking as a method. Basically grounding the foundations of African thought. It's reminiscent of a book written by an African scholar called Chimakonam Kamalu, Foundations of African Thought. And so in essence, the nature of African studies is that it must be based on, what Prof called the African thought system. And he said that in a nutshell, the challenge of African studies is basically to define the African thought system that grounds it, right? And you basically said that what makes a study African or what makes it an African studies is that it is grounded in the African thought system, right? So, and then, that was basically in summation what he was saying in terms of the nature of, African studies. And then he went on to discuss the African thought system. And this is where I think that the discussion was quite interesting because it was profound and, it highlighted a whole lot of things in terms of African logic. And I think it's based on his book, I think it's called Ezemazu, the African System of Logic. Of course, because of the constraint of time, we didn't get to, into the discussion around how, this African logic can help us to decolonize an African, studies or curriculum. But that's something that we can delve into another time. But when he began to discuss the African thought system, he basically, broke it into two elements, emphasizing defining what thought is and then defining what a system is, because, it's African thought system. It's a combination sort of, concept. And then, of course, he went on to, explain, the nature of African thought system, why it's important. And he said that it's important because it influences our behavior, it shapes how we perceive reality. And then, of course, he says that, one of the importance of the African thought system is that it helps us to overcome what he calls imitative thinking, right? And this is reminiscent of another African philosopher called Mohobe Ramose, a concept that he develops, to deal with this imitative thinking among African scholars, which he calls the Northbound gaze. I believe Professor Chimakonam would be familiar with the concept. And he said that, another important element of the African thought system is that it helps us to produce knowledge that will, contribute to the development of Africa. This is a discussion that one of the other leading African philosopher called Paulino Tenjo raises, when he critiques the idea of intellectual extroversion, the idea that most African philosophers, create ideas that are there to please the European, academics rather than develop, African thinkers, what he calls intellectual extroversion. I believe he conceptualizes this in his book called African Philosophy, Myth or Reality, and in other articles that he produced. Then, of course, Professor Chimakonam referred to the Calabar School of Thought, School of Philosophy and Conversational Philosophy as an example of, the evolution or the contribution to, the African thought system. And when he was discussing the African thought system, I get the sense that, concepts such as the worldview, that was the African worldview and culture and worldview that was developed by the likes of Marimbani in Urugu also the idea of the world sense as developed by Oyeronke Oyewumi, the invention of women in the seminal text, are also, part of the idea of the African thought system. So I was just thinking about some of those concepts, and I wish I had time to sort of, engage with Prof in terms of, the distinction between worldview and world senses developed by these other scholars who are contributing to the African-centered, sort of thought system. And then, of course, in terms of the conversational school of African philosophy, Prof. Chimakonam, of course, referred to the emergence of the school itself in the 1990s. And of course, I was thinking about, as someone who's interested in African philosophy, I was thinking about, Oruka's contribution, 4 trends of African philosophy, and I wanted to sort of understand how the conversational school comes in terms of the 4 trends. I know I mean, of course, the other African philosophers like Sinai Siroko Baham introduced the hermeneutical school. And what is the difference really between the hermeneutical school as developed by Sinai Siroko in his book called the African hermeneutical philosophy? How is it different from that, and the ethno-philosophical school and things like that is developed by Odero Oruka in his seminal essay on African philosophy? And then, of course, the interesting part was that, Professor Chimakonam gave, provided just a brief description on the nature of, the African thought system. He just basically, enumerated some of its elements, such as the foundational, the doctrinal, and the architectural, dealing with methods, dealing with logic and ontology as well as methods. And then in describing the nature of distinguishing African thought system from Western thought system, he basically sort of, tried to see how they're different from each other, and he gave, 2 examples. So I'm going to give 2 examples because he provided a long list of just, examples that shows the differences, what we can call the distinctive traits of each thought system. So in terms of the African thought system, he mentioned that it's holistic. One of its traits is that it's holistic, whereas the Western thought system said that it's analytic. I mean, this is also, he actually referred to David Bohm, who's one of the leading, who was, one of the leading European scientists, I think was involved in the Oppenheimer, creation of the little bomb, but that's not necessary. But David Bohm really grounds, he in his seminal book where he talks about the implicate order and the explicate order. I believe Professor Chimakonam is familiar with that. And I think Mogobe Ramos is also trying to deal with this by, grounding the holistic method in terms of the African philosophy of Ubuntu, what he calls the philopraxis of Ubuntu. And another idea was that, the African thought system is complementaristic, whereas the Western thought system is deterministic. And, so that was how Professor Chimakonam sort of, made that distinction between the Western thought system and the African thought system. And in terms of the importance of, grounding, African scholarship on the African thought system, he mentioned one interesting thing, that if we don't ground the African scholarship in the African thought system, or African studies in general, will produce what he calls Frankenstein scholarship. So yeah, that was in a nutshell my reflections. I could go on, but I mean, in the interest of time, I have to wrap it up and leave it there. But I'd like to thank Professor Chimakonam again for an interesting presentation, as well as the chair of the seminar, Professor Sipamandla Zondi, and the audience in general. And yeah, I think we'll have another seminar, I think, which will be based on the prison letters of Asare Shako as well as Winnie Mandela. And I think the date will be announced soon. So yeah, that's my contribution. So I'll hand it over back to Professor Sipamandla Zondi. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you. We have reached the end of our webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you and bye-bye.